The handcuffs clicked shut around my wrists as Sheriff Karen smiled that cold, calculating smile I had come to know so well. My neighbors watched from their porches as she dragged me toward the patrol car, my boots scraping against the gravel driveway of the ranch my grandfather built with his own hands. "This is what happens when you think you can fight the system," she whispered in my ear, her badge glinting in the afternoon sun. But what she did not know was that I had already won. 3 generations of my family had worked this land. Every morning, I woke up to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the gentle creak of the old windmill my grandfather installed in 1952. The ranch stretched across 400 acres of rolling hills, where my father taught me to ride before I could properly walk, and where I planned to teach my own children the same lessons about hard work and respect for the land. I remember the first time I saw Sheriff Karen. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring, and I was fixing a section of fence near the main road when her patrol car pulled up to the gate. She stepped out wearing crisp khakis and a badge that caught the sunlight, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun that made her face look sharp and severe. "Morning," she called out, walking over with that practiced smile that all politicians seem to master. "I am Karen Mitchell, the new sheriff. Just doing some community outreach, getting to know the folks in my jurisdiction." I wiped the sweat from my forehead and shook her hand. Her grip was firm, almost aggressive, and her eyes kept scanning my property with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Nice spread you got here," she said, but there was something in her tone that did not sound like a compliment. "How long has your family owned this land?" "Since 1943, I replied, feeling a strange need to justify my presence on my own property. "My grandfather bought it after he came back from the war." Karen nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on the main house and the barn before settling on the prime location where my land met the highway. Something flickered in her expression, quick as lightning, but I caught it. It was the look of someone appraising merchandise. "Well, I am sure we will be seeing more of each other," she said, climbing back into her patrol car. "You folks out here, you are the backbone of this community. Important to keep everything proper." After she drove away, I stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle on the road. My dog Rex came trotting over, sensing something was wrong. I scratched behind his ears and tried to shake off the feeling that Sheriff Karen had not been making a social call. She had been conducting an inspection. Over the next few weeks, I noticed her patrol car passing by my ranch more frequently than seemed necessary. Sometimes she would slow down, studying the property with those calculating eyes. Other times, she would park at the edge of my driveway and make phone calls, always facing toward my house. I mentioned it to my neighbor Bill, who had been farming the adjacent property for 30 years. He just shrugged and said small-town sheriffs often got bored and drove around looking for something to do. But Bill had not seen the way Karen looked at my land, like she was already planning what to do with it. The first citation arrived on a Thursday. Karen stood on my front porch holding a clipboard, flanked by 2 deputies who looked like they had been carved from the same block of granite. Both of them wore sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and neither of them spoke. "I am afraid we have a problem," Karen announced, not bothering with pleasantries this time. "Your livestock fence is 6 inches too close to the county easement. That is a violation of Municipal Code 47B. I stared at the fence line that had been in the exact same position for 40 years. "That fence has never been a problem before." "Well, it is a problem now," she replied, scribbling something on her clipboard. "You have 10 days to move it back 3 feet. Also, your barn needs fresh paint. Peeling paint is considered blight, which affects property values for the entire area." Deputy Martinez, the younger of her two shadows, stepped forward and handed me the citation. His fingers lingered on the paper longer than necessary, and when I looked up, he would not meet my eyes. "This is ridiculous," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "My barn looks better than half the buildings in town." Karen smiled that cold smile again. "Sir, I am just enforcing the law. If you have a problem with the law, you can take it up with the county commissioners." Over the next month, the citations kept coming. My mailbox was supposedly too close to the road. My gravel driveway created dust, which was an environmental hazard. The sign at my entrance was too large, violating signage ordinances that I was certain did not exist 6 months ago. Each violation came with a fine and a deadline. Each deadline was impossibly short. When I tried to comply, Karen would find new problems. I moved the fence back 3 feet, so she decided the new fence posts were not regulation height. I repainted the barn, so she declared that the color was not approved by the Historical Preservation Committee. "You are harassing me," I told her during one of her surprise inspections. We were standing in my cattle pen while she measured the distance between water troughs with a tape measure. "Harassment?" Karen laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sir, I am protecting this community. Your operation here has been grandfathered in for decades, but times change. Standards change. What was acceptable in your grandfather's day might not meet today's safety requirements." "Safety requirements for what? I have been raising cattle on this land for 15 years without a single incident." Karen finished her measurements and made a note on her clipboard. "Well, that is about to change. I have had complaints from concerned citizens about potential groundwater contamination from your livestock. We are going to need soil samples, water quality tests, and a full environmental impact assessment." "Complaints from who?" "That information is confidential." I watched her walk back to her patrol car, followed by her two silent deputies. She moved with the confidence of someone who held all the cards, someone who knew the game was rigged in her favor. But what I could not figure out was why she had chosen me as her target. The answer came 2 weeks later when I was in town buying supplies. Old Pete, who ran the hardware store, pulled me aside and lowered his voice to barely above a whisper. "You might want to be careful," he said, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Word is, there are some developers interested in your stretch of highway. Prime commercial real estate, they say." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. Sheriff Karen was not trying to improve community standards. She was trying to drive me off my land. The knock on my door came at 7 in the morning on a Monday. I opened it to find Karen standing there with a manila envelope in her hand and a satisfied expression on her face. Behind her, 3 deputies waited by their patrol cars, hands resting casually on their service weapons. "This is for you," she said, handing me the envelope with theatrical formality. "Official business." My hands trembled as I opened the seal and pulled out the documents inside. The words seemed to swim on the page, but the meaning was crystal clear. The county was exercising eminent domain to seize my property for public safety concerns related to environmental contamination and structural hazards. "This is impossible," I stammered. "You cannot just take someone's home based on made-up violations." "Made up?" Karen raised an eyebrow. "Sir, this decision is based on extensive documentation of health and safety violations that you have repeatedly failed to address. The environmental assessment found dangerous levels of contamination in your soil and groundwater. Your structures are considered unsafe for human habitation." "What environmental assessment?" I was never notified of any testing. Karen pulled out another set of papers. The testing was conducted last month while you were in town. We had every legal right to access your property for public safety purposes. The results are all here, signed by certified environmental specialists. I scanned the reports, my vision blurring with rage and disbelief. According to these documents, my land was practically a toxic waste dump. The barn was structurally unsound. The well water contained dangerous bacteria. Even my house was deemed uninhabitable due to foundation problems that supposedly posed an imminent collapse risk. "This is all lies," I said, my voice barely controlled. "These reports are complete fabrications." "Sir, I understand you are upset, but these are official findings from licensed professionals. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. After that, the county will take possession of the property and begin the necessary remediation work." "Remediation work? What are you really planning to do with my land?" Karen's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something cold and predatory in her expression. "That is not your concern anymore. You should focus on finding a new place to live." After she left, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the eviction notice until the words began to blur together. 30 days to leave the land that had been in my family for 3 generations. 30 days to abandon everything my grandfather and father had built. I called every lawyer in the county. Half of them would not return my calls. The other half gave me variations of the same response. Fighting eminent domain cases was expensive, time-consuming, and rarely successful, especially when public safety was involved. "The county has broad authority in these situations," explained Attorney Johnson, the only lawyer willing to meet with me in person. "If they have documented evidence of environmental hazards, the court will almost certainly side with them. But the evidence is fake. They never actually tested my property." Johnson leaned back in his chair and studied me with tired eyes. "Can you prove that? Do you have documentation showing you were never notified? Independent testing that contradicts their findings? Witnesses who can testify the inspections never happened?" I realized with growing horror that I could not prove any of it. Karen had been thorough in her deception. Every document bore official seals and signatures. Every report was properly formatted and filed. On paper, her case was airtight. "There is something else you should know," Johnson said, lowering his voice. "Sheriff Mitchell owns the building where the county courthouse is located. She also owns the building that houses most of the county administrative offices. Any legal challenge you file will be processed by people who are essentially her tenants." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Karen had not just captured the law enforcement apparatus of our county. She had captured the entire system of local government. She was landlord to the very officials who would decide my fate. That night, I walked my property for what I thought might be the last time. Every fence post, every tree, every building held memories of 3 generations of hard work and dreams. As I stood in the spot where my grandfather had first broken ground for the house, I made a decision that would change everything. If Karen thought she could steal my legacy through corruption and lies, she was about to learn that some fights are worth everything you have. I spent the next 2 weeks doing something I had never done before in my life. I became a detective. Every morning, I drove to the county record's office and requested documents: property transfers, rental agreements, business licenses, financial disclosures. I studied Karen's empire with the same intensity she had used to study my ranch. What I found was even worse than I had imagined. Sheriff Karen Mitchell did not just own the courthouse building. She owned 12 commercial properties throughout the county, including the buildings that housed the tax assessor, the planning commission, and the environmental services department. Every official who would handle my case was paying rent to the person trying to steal my land. But the most shocking discovery came when I dug into the rental agreements. Karen was charging the county nearly triple the market rate for office space. The building that housed the sheriff's department, for example, rented for $8,000 per month when comparable properties in town rented for $3,000. She is bleeding the taxpayers dry, I muttered to myself, photographing page after page of financial documents, and using the money to buy more property so she can bleed them even more. I also discovered that I was not her first victim. Over the past 3 years, Karen had used various pretexts to force 5 other property owners to sell their land. Environmental concerns, code violations, eminent domain for public projects that never seemed to materialize. Each property had been sold at below-market prices to shell companies that traced back to Karen's business network. The pattern was always the same: harassment through citations and inspections, escalation to legal threats, finally, forced sale or seizure when the property owner could not afford to fight back. It was a systematic campaign of legalized theft, enabled by her control of local law enforcement and government. But Karen had made one crucial mistake in her greed. According to the county charter, all government rental agreements had to be approved by the Board of Commissioners and renewed every 3 years. Karen's current lease on the courthouse building was set to expire in 6 months, and the renewal process required a public bidding period. I spent 3 days researching property law and commercial real estate transactions. Then I made a phone call that would change everything. "I want to buy the courthouse building," I told the real estate agent, a woman named Sandra who had handled several properties in the downtown area. "The courthouse, but that building is not for sale. Sheriff Mitchell owns it." "Everything is for sale at the right price. I want you to make her an offer she cannot refuse." Sandra was quiet for a long moment. "Can I ask why you want to buy a building that is completely leased to government offices?" I smiled for the first time in weeks, because I have some ideas about improving the rental terms. The next morning, I emptied my savings account, took out a loan against my ranch, and called in every favor from every friend and relative I had. By the end of the week, I had assembled enough capital to make Karen an offer that was 30% above the building's assessed value. She accepted within 24 hours, probably thinking she was getting away with highway robbery. What she did not realize was that she had just handed me the keys to her entire operation. The closing took place on a Friday afternoon in the same courthouse building I was purchasing. Karen sat across the conference table from me, barely able to contain her smugness, as she signed document after document transferring ownership of her most valuable property. "I have to say this is quite generous of you," she said, sliding the final papers across the table, "especially considering your current circumstances." "I believe in investing in the community," I replied, signing my name with a steady hand. "Sometimes you have to spend money to make money." Karen laughed. "Well, you certainly paid enough for this old building. I hope you know what you are doing." The moment the deed was recorded, I became the landlord of every county office except the sheriff's department, which was housed in a separate building that Karen still owned. But more importantly, I became Karen's business partner in a relationship she did not yet understand. I waited exactly 1 week before making my first move. On Monday morning, I walked into the county commissioner's office carrying a manila envelope of my own. "I need to discuss the rental agreement for this building," I told Commissioner Williams, a decent man who had always treated me fairly. What about it? The county has been renting from Sheriff Mitchell for 3 years without any problems. Sheriff Mitchell no longer owns this building. I do, and I am afraid the current rental terms are no longer acceptable. Williams looked confused. I do not understand. The lease does not expire for another 5 months. I opened my envelope and spread the documents across his desk. According to the lease agreement, any change in ownership triggers a renegotiation clause. The new rental rate will be $24,000 per month, effective immediately. Williams nearly choked on his coffee. 24,000. That is 3 times what we are paying now. Actually, it is exactly what Sheriff Mitchell charges for her other county properties. I am simply applying consistent market rates across all government leases. The beauty of my plan was that I was using Karen's own greed against her. She had spent years overcharging the county for office space, establishing a precedent that I could now invoke. If $8,000 per month was reasonable for the sheriff's department building, then $24,000 was reasonable for the courthouse, which was 3 times larger. This is outrageous, Williams sputtered. The county cannot afford those rates. Then perhaps you should consider relocating to more affordable space. I understand there are several vacant buildings in town that rent for much less. But we both knew there were no alternatives. The courthouse building was specifically designed for government operations, with holding cells, secure document storage, and specialized courtrooms that could not be replicated elsewhere. The county was trapped, just as I had been trapped when Karen targeted my ranch. Within 2 hours, news of the rent increase had spread throughout the building. By afternoon, Sheriff Karen Mitchell was standing in the courthouse lobby, her face flushed with rage. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" she demanded, cornering me near the elevator. "I am being a responsible landlord," I replied calmly, "making sure my tenants pay fair market rates for premium office space." "This is extortion." "No, this is business. The same business you have been conducting for the past 3 years. Karen stepped closer, lowering her voice to a threatening whisper. "You have no idea what you are messing with. I can make your life very difficult. More difficult than losing my family ranch to fake environmental reports. I think you have already done your worst." That afternoon, I implemented the second phase of my plan. I had also purchased the private parking lot adjacent to the courthouse, the lot where Karen parked her personal vehicle every day. I posted new signs restricting parking to building tenants only, and I had Karen's car towed. She found me in the courthouse cafeteria an hour later. My car was illegally towed from a public parking lot. Actually, it is a private parking lot. I own it. And according to the new parking regulations, only building tenants in good standing are permitted to park there. I am a building tenant. The sheriff's department rents space from me in the other building. I pulled out a folder and showed her the parking agreement. This parking lot serves the courthouse building exclusively. Since you do not rent space in this building, you do not have parking privileges. Karen stared at the document, her hands trembling with fury. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. She was beginning to understand that the tables had turned completely. "You cannot do this to me," she said, but her voice had lost its commanding edge. "Watch me." The next few weeks were the most satisfying of my entire life. I watched Karen scramble like a rat in a maze, desperately trying to find a way out of the trap she had built for herself. The county commissioners held emergency meetings to discuss the rental crisis. Local newspapers picked up the story. State officials began asking questions about why government operations in our county cost 3 times more than neighboring jurisdictions. Karen's first move was to try to relocate county operations to buildings she still owned. But those buildings were already leased to other government departments at her inflated rates. Moving the courthouse would require breaking existing leases, finding alternative space for displaced departments, and somehow fitting specialized courtroom operations into buildings never designed for that purpose. Her second move was to offer me a personal deal. She showed up at my ranch on a Tuesday evening, her usual confidence replaced by barely controlled desperation. "Look, we both know this has gotten out of hand," she said, standing on the porch where she had served me the eviction notice weeks earlier. "What do you want? Money. I can make the environmental reports disappear. Your ranch stays in your family, and we forget this whole thing ever happened." "What I want is justice," I replied. "Something you should understand, being a sheriff and all." "Justice? You are bankrupting the county over some petty revenge scheme." "I am charging the same rates you established. If those rates are bankrupting the county, maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to get rich off taxpayer money." Karen's mask finally slipped completely. "You have no idea how things work around here. I have connections. I have power. You are just some farmer who thinks he can play games with people who actually matter." "People who actually matter." I stepped closer, and for the first time in our relationship, she took a step back. "Like the 5 families you drove off their land with fake violations. Like the taxpayers you have been robbing blind for 3 years. Or do you mean the developers who are paying you to clear prime real estate for their projects?" Her face went pale. "You do not know what you are talking about." "I know exactly what I am talking about. I have copies of every financial record, every property transfer, and every rental agreement. I know about the shell companies and the kickbacks and the whole corrupt system you built to enrich yourself at everyone else's expense." That night, Karen made her biggest mistake yet. Desperate to regain some control over the situation, she tried to use her remaining authority as sheriff to intimidate me. She showed up at my ranch with 2 deputies and attempted to arrest me on charges of financial terrorism against county government. But word of her plan had already leaked. Commissioner Williams, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Karen's methods, had tipped off a reporter from the state newspaper. When Karen arrived at my ranch with handcuffs ready, she found 3 journalists and a camera crew waiting in my driveway. "Sheriff Mitchell, can you comment on reports that you have been overcharging the county for office space?" called out the lead reporter as Karen approached my door. "Is it true that you own most of the buildings housing county government?" asked another. "What is your response to allegation that you used your position to force property owners to sell their land below market value?" Karen froze like a deer in headlights. The deputies behind her looked uncertain, clearly realizing they were being used in what might be an illegal arrest. After a long moment, Karen turned around and walked back to her patrol car without saying a word. The story ran on the front page of the state newspaper the next morning. "Small-town sheriff accused of corruption and abuse of power." By afternoon, it had been picked up by television stations and online news outlets. By evening, the state attorney general's office had announced they were opening an investigation into irregularities in government contracting in our county. Karen's empire was crumbling, and everyone could see it happening in real time. The state investigators arrived on a Monday morning in 3 black SUVs that looked like something from a movie. They set up their temporary headquarters in the courthouse building I now owned, which created a delicious irony that was not lost on anyone involved. Karen, was being investigated by people who were literally paying me rent. The lead investigator was a woman named Agent Martinez, who carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had taken down much bigger fish than a small county sheriff. She interviewed me on the first day, and I handed over copies of every document I had collected during my investigation. "This is quite extensive," she said, reviewing the financial records. "How long did it take you to put all this together?" "About 3 weeks. It would have taken less time if I had known what to look for from the beginning." Agent Martinez smiled grimly. "In my experience, corruption this extensive usually takes years to uncover. The fact that you documented it so quickly suggests Sheriff Mitchell got sloppy. She got greedy. Greedy people make mistakes." Over the next 2 weeks, the investigation expanded far beyond what I had originally uncovered. Federal agents discovered that Karen's corruption network extended into neighboring counties. She had been coordinating with other officials to create artificial real estate markets, manipulating property values, and funneling taxpayer money through a web of shell companies and fraudulent contracts. The environmental reports that were used to justify seizing my ranch were completely fabricated. The certified environmental specialists, who supposedly conducted the testing, did not exist. Even the laboratory that allegedly processed the soil samples turned out to be a post office box in another state. Karen's downfall accelerated when other victims began coming forward. Once people realized she was being investigated by federal agents, the fear that had kept them silent for years began to evaporate. Property owners, contractors, and even some of her own deputies provided testimony about years of extortion, bribery, and abuse of power. The most damaging testimony came from Deputy Martinez, the younger officer who had served as one of Karen's enforcers. Faced with federal charges of his own, he agreed to cooperate with investigators. He revealed that Karen had been running what was essentially a protection racket, targeting property owners for harassment unless they agreed to sell their land to her associates at below-market prices. She called it economic development, Martinez testified during a public hearing that was broadcast live on local television. But really, it was just organized theft with badges. On a Thursday afternoon in late October, Karen Mitchell resigned as sheriff. She stood at a podium in the same courthouse lobby where she had confronted me about the rent increase, reading from a prepared statement while federal agents waited nearby. "Due to false accusations and politically motivated attacks on my character, I am stepping down from my position effective immediately," she read, her voice barely audible. "I maintain my innocence and look forward to clearing my name in court." But there would be no clearing her name. By the end of the week, federal prosecutors had filed charges including racketeering, extortion, mail fraud, and conspiracy. Karen Mitchell, who had once controlled an entire county through fear and corruption, was facing the rest of her life in federal prison. As I watched her being led away in handcuffs, I felt something I had not expected. It was not triumph or satisfaction. It was sadness for the community she had poisoned and the trust she had destroyed. Justice had been served, but the damage she had done would take years to repair. 6 months after Karen's arrest, I faced the biggest decision of this entire ordeal. The county commissioners came to me with a proposal to buy back the courthouse building at the same inflated price I had paid Karen. They wanted to return to the old rental arrangement, minus the corruption. I sat in my kitchen for hours, staring at the purchase offer and thinking about what my grandfather would have done. He had always taught me that revenge was like poison. It hurt the person holding it more than the person it was meant for. But he had also taught me that sometimes you have to fight for what is right, even when the cost is higher than you can afford. In the end, I decided to split the difference. I sold the courthouse building back to the county at my original purchase price, taking a significant loss on the deal. But I kept the parking lot, which I converted into a small memorial garden for the families who had lost their property to Karen's schemes. The new sheriff was a woman named Rebecca Torres, who had transferred from the state police specifically to help rebuild trust in local law enforcement. She was everything Karen had pretended to be: professional, honest, and genuinely committed to serving the community rather than exploiting it. Your actions probably saved this county from years of additional corruption, Torres told me during one of her visits to my ranch. Most people would have just given up and moved away. Moving away would have meant Karen won, I replied, and I was not about to let that happen. The legal proceedings against Karen dragged on for more than a year. She eventually pleaded guilty to most of the charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 12 years in federal prison. Her properties were seized and sold to pay restitution to her victims. The 5 families who had lost their land were able to buy it back at fair market prices using funds from the asset forfeiture. My own ranch was officially cleared of all environmental concerns after independent testing confirmed what I had known all along. The soil and water were perfectly clean. The county formally apologized for the attempted seizure and dismissed all the fraudulent violations Karen had filed against my property. But the most meaningful change was not legal or financial. It was cultural. Karen's downfall had taught our community an important lesson about the price of remaining silent in the face of corruption. People began attending county commissioner meetings. They started asking questions about government contracts and spending. They demanded transparency and accountability from their elected officials. I found myself serving on the Citizen Oversight Committee that was established to prevent future abuses. It was not a role I had ever wanted, but I had learned that democracy requires active participation from ordinary people who are willing to stand up when something is wrong. On quiet evenings, I still walked the boundaries of my ranch, checking fence lines and watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and purple. But now I see the land differently. It is not just my family's legacy. It is part of a community that I helped save from a predator who wore a badge. Rex still trots alongside me during these walks, though he is grayer now and moves a little slower. Sometimes we stop at the spot where Karen first approached me with her fake smile and her calculating eyes. I think about how different things might have been if I had not fought back, if I had simply accepted her authority and surrendered my birthright. The truth is, I never expected to win. When I emptied my savings account to buy that courthouse building, I thought I was probably throwing my money away on a futile gesture. But sometimes the most important battles are the ones you fight not because you expect to win, but because losing without fighting would cost you something more valuable than money or property. It would cost you your soul. And that was something Sheriff Karen could never take away from me, no matter how many fake reports she filed or how many corrupt officials she bought. In the end, that made all the difference.